Greetings from Shraddha Dev Chaudhary in San Diego. I'm very disappointed I'm not able to attend the 8th International Conference on Interdisciplinary Social Sciences in Prague this year in person, but I thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to participate virtually and present my paper entitled Taslima Nasrin and Arundhati Roy, Poets, Playwrights, Polemicists, or Rebels Without a Pause. The decades-long tirade of Nasrin and Roy against exploitation of every sort, governmental, corporate, or societal, has meant bounty hunters and exile from Bangladesh for Nasrin, and a jail sentence, albeit symbolic, and sedition threats for Roy in India. As each author floods the media from within the geographical confines of South Asia or in the diaspora, with explosive exposés on issues ranging from God to globalization, fundamentalism to feminism, and militarism to Maoism, this paper questions whether they have transitioned from autobiographers and littérateurs to great, for trifle sensationalist, political analysts, or if the media itself, both domestic and foreign, with its relentless entourage of videographers and interview seekers, has thrust the greatness of political analysis on these giants' shoulders. Of course, if you ask the authors themselves if they are, say, feminists or environmentalists, they will be somewhat ambivalent. If you ask them whether they are humanists or internationalists, they would be possibly a little more comfortable saying yes. And if you flat out label them as rebels, they would most likely heave a sigh of relief, because throughout their entire career, their entire life in fact, they have waged a relentless war against confinement of every sort. They have both fiercely used the media to repeatedly expose and reduce multi-level power differential. The media in turn has responded with unceasing if controversial coverage these past 2 decades. So there is complete access to the WMDs, weapons of mass disclosure as I call them, and their arsenal. The varied readership is regaled with an unending plethora of newspaper editorials, magazine articles, interviews, dissection of radio and conference addresses, and oh yes, the barrage of blogs, some going into a multi-page analysis of why their marriages failed rather than why their writing succeeded. Well, let's see why their writing succeeded. Take, for instance, Nasrin, on whom I focus in the first half of the paper and in the first video. In My Girlhood and Shame, Nasrin recalls vividly how in March 1971, Bangladesh's assertion of independence was met with fierce repression by the Pakistani army and a heinous military rape. Nasrin was just 9, but the horrors of the war were deeply etched into her mind, as the following harrowing image depicts. Quote, Grandma rummaged among the bones. Thousands had been recovered from the well near the big mosque in the town, and many people went to look. Some had lost their sons, others their husbands. Grandma picked up shin bones, ribs, arms, skulls, looking for her son. As daylight faded and darkness set in, everyone left, wiping their eyes with their handkerchiefs as they departed. Grandma, however, continued to sit, lost in a mountain of human bones, still looking for the ones that might be Hashem's. End quote. Equally graphic is a recollection of how she lay frozen on her bed when Pakistani soldiers marched through her bedroom, shone the flashlight on her face and on that of her younger sister, and moved on in search of more suitable prey. As the memory of that night and the general plight of women in the war haunts and taunts her, Nasrin laments, yet the definition of rape didn't change for us. While our political leaders were making fine speeches about the lost honor of our mothers and sisters, my aunt hanged herself from the ceiling. It was her only way to escape dishonor. This theme of dishonor is constant in Nasrin's poetry and prose. From the moment of birth until the moment she dies, at which point alone she can enter the cemetery, which otherwise has cautionary signs, as Nasrin points out, keeping animals and women out. The girl, the woman, faces dishonor. How can someone whose birth is undesired exercise any choice, asks Nasrin. Even as a child, the endless restrictions begin, on dress, demeanor, conduct, association, speech, first in her own home and then in that of the in-laws. In Revenge, the female protagonist Chumor faces claustrophobic injunctions as she commits the unpardonable crime of standing in the window and looking out, and heaven forbid, laughing heartily. It became a mystery to Chumor as to when her attentive, charming, romantic fiancé turned into the proverbial lord and master, hawkishly watching her every move, jealously and zealously keeping her in seclusion, baselessly concluding that the child conceived within 6 weeks of their marriage was not his, and forcing an abortion on her. "I won't go. I won't have it ripped from me," Jumor had cried out, but I knew I had no choice. Deeply resentful of her husband's renewed efforts at seclusion, Jumor seemingly complied as she plotted deliberately to have a child with the neighbor. Her husband had no clue that the son he loved and adored was not his. Jumor had her ultimate revenge. Nasrin argues, quote, "Every woman is oppressed, irrespective of class," end quote. At the back of Progress, a poem, she writes, "The chap who sits in the air-conditioned office, this chap goes home and beats his wife for a handkerchief or a shirt collar. The employee who's speaking in such a low voice that no one knows or would ever suspect how much he could raise his voice at home, how foul his language could be. Returning home, he beats his wife for a bar of soap or for the baby's pneumonia. The bearer who brings the tea, he has divorced his first wife for sterility, his second wife for giving birth to a daughter. He's divorced his third wife for not bringing dowry. Returning home, this chap beats his fourth wife for a couple of green chilies and a handful of cooked rice." Nasrin realized that society has conditioned women of all classes to expect nothing better or retaliate, perhaps because of the futility of it all, just like she did, or didn't for that matter, when she was 18 or 19, when an unknown teenage boy passing by her pressed a half-burned cigarette on her bare arm. As she winced with pain, quote, "The boy laughed indifferently and walked off," end quote, and she kept quiet, knowing that if she called for help, the people, quote, "would crowd around and watch the fun," end quote. Instead, years later, she published the following poem, Character. "You're a girl, and you'd better not forget that when you cross the threshold of your home, men will look askance at you. If you've got no character, you will turn back, and if you have, you'll keep on going as you're going now." And she did, because she had character and resolve and the vision to guide others, to question, to challenge the absurd presuppositions of a patriarchal society. In a letter to Dolly, a person she never met but whose presence she felt in her heart, Nasrin writes, quote, "On behalf of all women, I condemn you. Let not another cowardly, weak, man-mad woman like you be born." End quote. Dolly had just committed suicide because her husband had served her divorce papers. In the poem Simple Talk, Nasrin questions the masculine-feminine power differential that has become axiomatic in Bangladeshi society. From XX a person is born, from XY also a person is born. There is no reason for them to be divided, yet one group promptly grabbed for its portion the cushioned chair, the thick mattress on the bed, 80% of the property, and the head of the fish. On another plate lay the leftovers and the bones. Nasrin also exposes the moral hypocrisy when she attacks society's fierce insistence on women's virginity and monogamy, all the while condoning both their commodification as well as men's sexual license. Her poem, The Game in Reverse, is a radical stance against such hypocrisy. The other day in Ramla Park, I saw a boy buying a girl. I'd really like to buy a boy for 5 or 10 taka. A clean-shaven boy with a fresh shirt, combed and parted hair. A boy on the park bench or standing on the road in a curvaceous pose. I'd like to grab the boy by his collar and pull him into a rickshaw, tickling his neck and belly. I'd make him giggle. Bringing him home, I'd give him a sound thrashing with high-heel shoes and then throw him out. Behind this caustic humor, Nasrin feels compelled to expose women's humiliation with brutal candor, almost like shock therapy for the reader. But sometimes it wasn't received well. Nasrin once wrote, quote, "I don't know how to please readers. I simply know how my eyes fill with tears as I write every column, every sentence. Every word in each sentence takes shape from my heart, not from my pen," end quote. Nowhere is this more poignantly obvious than the poem Noor Jahan, where the woman alone pays the ultimate price for adultery. They have made Noor Jahan stand in a hole in the courtyard. There she stands, submerged to her waist with head hanging. They're throwing stones at Noor Jahan. Those stones are striking my body. Are these stones not striking you? As Nasrin paints a lurid picture of mocking mullahs relishing the inhuman torture of Noor Jahan, she knows she must continue this tirade against fundamentalism, against a government where even with a woman prime minister and a woman leader of the opposition, there has been no protest, no condemnation. In cannonade, she writes, "Special branch guards are on 24-hour duty in front of my door. Who comes and who goes, when I leave, when I enter the house, they write down everything in a notebook. But the things they cannot note down are which thoughts come and go into my head. What is it I nurture in my consciousness? The government has cannons and rifles, and a little mosquito like me has a sting." And what a sting that was. That year she published Shame. Already her journalistic exposés led to fundamentalists pronouncing a fatwa against her and offering a bounty for her death. Shame, published in the aftermath of the Babri Masjid incident in India, created a furore because Nasrin drew attention to the government's treatment of Hindu minorities and their exodus to India, accounting for the decline in Hindu population by about 500,000. Nasrin faced criticism from both progressives at home and in India, some suggesting that she unsuspectingly played into the hands of the Hindu fundamentalists, and of course she incurred the wrath of the Muslim fundamentalists as well. There were those who felt that neither the tone nor the timing was appropriate. Nasrin herself writes in the preface, quote, "I do not think I should apologize to anybody for writing this book. It is the agony of my heart which I've poured onto the pages of this little book," end quote. Once again there were calls for her death. Fundamentalists demanded her execution by hanging when she supposedly recommended revisions to Islam in an interview in India. The Bangladesh government filed charges against her for hurting the people's religious sensibilities and issuing an arrest warrant. Nasrin, fearing she would be murdered in jail, went into hiding and appealed to Amnesty International and finally became an exile in Sweden. And in recent years she has lived in India intermittently. Overnight she had become a celebrity. Her books were translated in 20 languages. Her 4 autobiographies were banned by the Bangladeshi government because they felt that they contained anti-Islam sentiments that could destroy the religious harmony of Bangladesh. In 2003, the West Bengal government banned the sale, collection and distribution of the third part of Nasrin's autobiography, Split in Two. But the ban was lifted in 2004. She continued to be controversial not just among Bengalis in the Indian subcontinent, but also in the diasporic Bengali community. This was evident in 2005 when she attempted to read an anti-war poem called America to a large Bengali crowd in Madison Square Garden, and she was booed off the stage. In 2006, in the Danish cartoon-related controversy, Nasrin, with 11 other journalists, artists and intellectuals, including Salman Rushdie, signed a document called Manifesto, Together Facing the New Totalitarianism. The manifesto states, quote, "We, writers, journalists, intellectuals, call for resistance to religious totalitarianism and for the promotion of freedom, equal opportunity, and secular values for all." Nasrin's pursuit of secularism, which is inextricably linked with the fundamental principles of feminism, which clearly are an integral part of humanism, continue in exile as she remembers, recounts, and reshapes her experiences with the proliferation of prose and poetry pieces, some deeply personal and some for the promotion of specific causes. In my girlhood, Nasrin had written years ago about an intense personal tragedy, about being raped as a child. Quote, "After that I felt myself split in two. One half went out with all the other children, played games, and ran around. The other half sat alone and depressed by the pond, or the train tracks, or on the steps by our door, alone even in the middle of a crowd." End quote. The same anguish she felt as a child, she saw reflected in the eyes of the other young girls and women victims she met as professionals or in passing, time and again. In a documentary made in exile, appropriately entitled Fearless, Nasrin speaks softly, lyrically, yet with all this mouldering resolve of a militant healer. And all this media attention, the invitations, the lectures, the awards, were too much pressure on her that ultimately it didn't matter. She didn't really know about feminism. Quote, "I don't have to know. If I know the pain of a little girl, of a little village, of a little country, it's enough." End quote. And so it was, until it became a big story, very much like Arundhati Roy's first and so far only novel, The God of Small Things, which catapulted her into the world of literary giants and won her the Booker T. Prize for Literature in 1997, and on whom I focus in the second half of this paper in a subsequent video. Thank you.